Next up, we're going to look at another project type, the projector project. In this project, we'll first go over projectors and projection screens and how to use them in both the Screens and Mapping tab. We'll then move on to a more complicated setup with a two-projector blend where I'll show you how to utilize the Warp and Softedge tabs to get all of your projection mapping done. Let's go. Okay, so I've got a brand new project here, and the first thing we're going to do, as always, is start in our Screens tab. And here we need to talk about the difference between the displays and LED panels we've used so far and the screens that we're going to be using in this video. So we have active screens in displays and LED panels. Active screens or emissive screens are screen objects that emit pixels. So there are things that a video signal will plug directly into. So you could actually take an HDMI cable and plug it directly into one of these displays or some sort of LED processor. This is in contrast to the screens or reflective surfaces, or sometimes called passive surfaces. These are things that are going to reflect pixels of some kind, probably coming from a projector. So we can twirl down our screens and go to generic, and we've got a bunch of different generic objects here. I'm going to start with this generic flat screen. We could also drag in a generic circle, and this generic circle is kind of great because I could go over to the inspector and it has these mesh properties here. So I could change this to be something like a triangle or some sort of pentagon. We'll delete that one. So this generic flat screen, which I'll bring just into the center of my workspace here, I'm going to rename this, as we always do when we're in the Screens tab. And this is where checking that canvas resolution becomes really, really important. That's because the passive screen category doesn't actually have a true resolution. If we think about this in a real world perspective, a screen surface of some kind could have any type of projector projected onto it. It doesn't really matter what the canvas resolution of that surface is. You could have a 4K projector projecting on a screen or a 1920 by 1080 projector. So this canvas resolution is kind of hard because we need to determine how many pixels will ultimately fall on that surface. We can typically find this information by doing some sort of projector study or doing some sort of math. We'll talk about some of that math later on when we talk about a two projector blend, but we always want to check this canvas resolution. If we don't, we may end up with a texture in our output that doesn't quite match what we're trying to actually output onto our screen surface. So in this case, I have a monitor, a 1920 by 1080 monitor that is going to act as my projector. So in this case, this 1920 by 1080 will work here. We'll notice that if I grab the handles here, our size increases in the width and our canvas resolution is changing with that size. I can do that vertically as well. If I tab off these two settings here, that resolution no longer changes with my size. So that's one way that we can start to alter that canvas resolution as we make our passive screen object in the Screens tab when we're working on a projector project. So I'll delete that and bring in a new one. And once again, rename it. And we'll just confirm that 1920 by 1080 is what we want here. And that's all we're going to do in the Screens tab. Okay, so now we're in the Mapping tab, and here we're going to go to our stuff, our library over here, and our library really changes in the Mapping tab, especially with our projection project, because here we are going to grab one of these brands of projectors and bring it into the workspace. So we could grab something like a barcode projector. You can search in here. My good friend, the UDX, is one that I'm quite familiar with. So we could click and drag that in if we wanted. We can also resize the workspace a little bit to see information about these projectors. So I can see what the resolution is, what the brightness is of it. If there's some projector that you're looking for, I'll delete this one from the workspace, that is not in our database, please let us know, but you can always grab a generic projector and drag that in, and that generic projector will allow you to change any properties that you want and build a custom projector just in case we don't have one. Once I've brought in my projector, I'm going to make sure that I am in the Projectors selection mode. And again, I can always change that using F4. And I'm going to click on my projector, and we'll get a bunch of information that populates over in the inspector. I can change that projector name, main PJ. I can change the color. A pretty common practice is to change the color of your screen and your projector and your layer and compositing to the same color, so that way everything matches. We'll skip some of this and move down to the properties here. This resolution we can change on our generic projector. We can scroll down even more to see our world transformation. And I'm going to hold shift and click into here. So once again, I can move everything just like I could in the Screens tab. If we go down even further, we have this lens properties. This is really great. It's not super exciting on the generic projector, although we could add in a bunch of information here if we wanted to. But if I go grab that UDX again, and let's grab that W40, I can bring that one in down here. And if I select that one and go down to the lens properties, we can see in our lens properties here, if we click on this lens type, we actually get more lens options here. And these correspond to the lenses in the database that match up with this projector. So if I select one, we can see that the frustum of the projector actually changes based on what lens we're using here. And we can use these properties to change the zoom or change some of the other properties if that particular projector has the capability to do that. I'll go ahead and delete that one out of here. Again, we're just worried about our main projector here, and we're not going to worry about changing any properties. Now that we've brought in a projector, I want to line it up perfectly with my projection screen here. The way we're going to do that is you can use this tool in the workspace toolbar called the Auto Transform Editor. And you'll see that Control-Alt-A applies current settings. And by default, when you first open up PIXERA, Control-Alt-A will apply the settings of a 1x1 projector. So if I do Control-Alt-A, you can see it automatically snapped that projector so that it can see the whole screen object here. Let's go ahead and undo that and open up the Auto Transform Editor. This now gives us a bunch of options in here where I can multiply the number of objects that I want to make from my selected object. And I can swirl down this align details where I could match up my projector to a screen in a specific distribution. So in this case, I want to just do a 1x1 distribution. I can hit preview. We see that snaps it to the edge of the screen there, and I'll go ahead and hit apply. Next up, we need to assign our projector to an output. We're going to do this in pretty much the exact same way we've done it before. Let's go to the Live tab, and I'll just click on my Identify Outputs, and we can see that my output down here is Graphics Card 1, Output 7. So I'll navigate to my Live tab and twirl down my Graphics Card 1, and I can see Output 7 over here. So I'll just click and drag that. And because we are in projector selection mode, I can just drag that right onto my projector to assign it. I just want to take a look at the I/O routing tab while we're talking about projectors. You'll see that the I/O tab looks slightly different. This is because unlike emissive or active screens, we aren't able to assign a feed directly to a passive screen object. We need some sort of pixel emitting device like a projector to go in between. So we actually have to have our output go to a projector, and then that is assigned to a screen object. So that just looks slightly different than what our display might look like. Here's a look at what that setup looks like with the difference between an active screen object and a passive screen object, and how those signal paths change a little bit in I/O routing. Okay, so I've assigned that output to that projector. Let's go back to preview, and I'm going to turn off my identify output here. Going to hit F5. We see that Alt Escape. Remember, that's just the program doing that in the background. You don't need to actually hit anything there. And if I hit my test pattern, we should see that test pattern appear on my output. All right, let's take a look at our projectors a little more closely and look at how we can warp and do some soft edge blending on them. So if we select our projector, making sure that we are in the projector selection mode, again, F4 on that, I can select the projector and I can go over to my inspector here and I can click on the warp tab. This warp tab is where we can do all of our projection warping. I'm going to drag this out a little bit to make this workspace a little bit bigger. If this workspace isn't big enough for me, as long as I am focused into it, so if I click into this workspace, I can press the M key, or I can use this button here that says Show Projector Mapping in Workspace. And that will actually flip that workspace into my main workspace. And notice that some of those tabs go with it. So I can flip that back, or I can just hit that button back and forth. We have a workspace toolbar here as well. We have a reset camera for this workspace, a couple of different types of locking that we can do, our test pattern to turn on and off, and importantly, we have this edit mesh button, which looks like a little pencil or a pen. This edit mesh allows us, with the E hotkey or just by pressing the button, allows us to cycle through the different types of editing we have for our warp here. We have a couple of different types of warp modifiers we can do. We have FFD modifiers. FFD stands for Free Form Deformer. Or we have vertex modifiers. And if I press the E button, you can see that I'm cycling between editing those different modifiers. We can always add a new modifier. I would recommend not adding any vertex modifiers. These are only useful in certain scenarios. The FFD modifier becomes much more useful. If we're in FFD modifier edit mode, we can turn on this display control points on output, and then you'll see those yellow dots get displayed on your output, which may make it a little easier to select specific points when you're working. When we're trying to warp, we can grab each of these control points individually, and I can move them around to warp them. I can also use the Alt hotkey and use my arrow keys to jump around between my points to select different ones. So if Alt arrow key moves the control point selection, arrow key is going to move the control point itself by 1 pixel. And if I hold Shift arrow key, then I'll get 5 pixels per click. Let's talk about some of these modifiers here. So our FFD modifier, we can twirl that information down. And here we can see the name. We also can change our segments. So that gives me a number of segments that we can change up there. If we have a couple of segments, we also have this interpolate control points between corners. Notice that without that checked, notice how our handles here are kind of controlling each corner individually. If I turn on this interpolate, then when I move my corner, I'm able to move my whole warp together. So that's what that interpolate control points between corners is. This calculate perspective distortion is something that we would be using if we had some sort of 3D object that we were trying to warp onto. Next up, we have the interpolation. So we can change between Bezier, linear, or this last one, which I'm going to butcher, is Catmull Rom. Each of these are just a different way that we can interpolate the math between our handles here. We can see this pretty pronounced between linear, where we're getting just straight lines between everything, and Bezier, where we get curves between everything. This scale and offset is not super useful in our default FFD modifier, but if we add a second one, which I could go now to edit that second one, so I can change this scale so that I can change where those control points are. And you'll notice if I make it a full 1x1 to be the full width and height of my output, I can't actually select the control points on the exterior or the perimeter of my FFD modifiers. So we can just move this center one. The offset lets us move that around. And I can reset the control points on any of my modifiers by saying reset, or I can reset just a specific one. Additionally, I could remove a modifier. So here I can click remove modifier, and that will get rid of that FFD modifier too. If we go to our vertex modifier, one thing that we can see here is there's actually not a lot we can do with the vertex modifier. That's because when we're actually altering our FFD modifiers, we are altering all of our vertex modifiers as well. You need to have vertices in your screen object in order for FFD modifiers to work appropriately. This means if you're bringing in some sort of custom 3D object, you would want to make sure that you have several vertices in your object and not just have the corners, or else you won't be able to warp them appropriately. Another thing we can do is if we scroll back to the top of our warp here, we can change whether or not we are bypassing the warping. So you'll see when I uncheck that, my output down here goes back to being a full screen object without any warps done. All right, let's go over to our Softedge tab where we can look at our Softedge blending and our masking effects. So if I click on Softedge, it's a very similar workspace. Got some options down here and a workspace up here. I have two different types of soft edges, Softedge Warp and Softedge Screen Aligned. I can add them by clicking the plus button, which will add an element. So if I add this Softedge Warped, we'll see that appears in my workspace here, and it appears on my output. Now, what does Softedge Warped mean? Well, that means that if I go to my Warp tab, and let's just start doing a little warping here, we can start to see that our Softedge follows that warp. And if I go back to the Softedge tab and start moving this around, you can see that that Softedge is sticking to the warp. That might look better with some content, so I'm going to turn off my test patterns here, and we can see that that warp is kind of, that Softedge is kind of moving around the warp there. I can twirl down that element, and we'll see that I have a bunch of different options here. So I can change the shape of that element from Softedge to a mask, which I could then move around. Or I could change it to an image. Now, this one's pretty cool. You can actually go grab an image, and I'll go grab one from my content here. And we can see that that image will actually be plastered onto our warp as well. So it's a great way to warp a whole projector if we want. I'll go back to the mask, and you can actually change the interpolation of either the mask or the Softedge between linear and Bezier. Now, what does that mean? Well, these masks and soft edges, we can actually edit just like we could with our warp. So if I click on the edit tool, we can see some very tiny dots appear now on my soft edge. I'm going to flip that into the workspace, make that a little bigger. I can zoom in, and now I can really grab these. So I could make my gradient a little bigger, and let's actually change this to a mask. And now we can actually select these points here. I can change how those points are affected. I can change that to linear, so that's going to take away those Bezier handles. I could change my gradient, which will give us that mask there. And if I turn off that edit tool, I can still move this thing around. And you may need to kind of click out and click back in order to get that to move around. We have a bunch of other options here for controlling the gradient or doing something like black level correction. And a note here that this black level correction can be helpful, but it is no substitute for black level correction on the projector itself. If I change back to Softedge, I can click on these little shortcuts here, which will snap the gradient or the soft edge to one side of the warp itself, which can be useful for doing some quick masking if you want. You can also export the soft edges as a PNG file if you want to use those as content later on. So that's warped soft edge. So what is screen aligned soft edge? Well, if I click on this button, we see we add another element. And again, if I twirl this down, I could also rename this and call this screen aligned mask. I could rename this one as well. But when I make this soft edge screen aligned, I can't actually select anything here. And that's because up in this top left corner, or up in this top left corner here, if my workspace is flipped back over to the inspector, I can do a selection of which plane of soft edges I'm working with. So I have my warped soft edge or I have my screen aligned soft edge. So if I click on that, now I can actually work with my screen aligned soft edges. These are slightly different. Let's turn that test pattern back on. The screen aligned soft edge is going to correspond with the outline of the output itself. So if I go to my soft edge mask, I could click on this left and it'll snap to the left side of the output. And I can't quite see that on my output down here. So let's just make the gradient really big until it starts to cover up some of my screen itself. A really great use case for your soft edge screen aligned is to turn this into a mask. And you can then use this as your architecture blocker. So that way you're not mapping onto any air conditioning vents or something like that. You can turn on the edit tool here. If you double click, you can add points to the mask. So I can kind of make a custom jagged edge that cuts off of like a proscenium or something if I'm doing some theater. I can make that gradient a little bigger. So that would be a use case for your soft edge screen aligned. Again, all the same options down here. All right, so this is a more complicated project that we have set up. I have a 2-projector blend going, and I have just some content running on this screen. Down here, I have a live feed from an NDI capture that I'm doing live in the room with me. And here is just an output, so we can see what I'm doing on the output as I'm doing it. All right, so I've created a new project here. We'll start where we always do in the Screens tab, over in our library. I'll go grab a generic flat screen and bring it in. I'm going to select it, and I can resize this to the exact size that my object is down here. I know that it is 0.4 meters tall or 40 millimeters, or, excuse me, wide, and I know that it is 0.18 millimeters tall. And let's go ahead and center that up in our workspace. And I'll just zoom in a little bit to recenter it. And as always, before I leave the Screens tab, I'm going to rename. And I'm going to check my canvas resolution. And look at that, 200 by 90. So this isn't very good, obviously. And if we were to keep that canvas resolution, let's look at what happens in the mapping tab. You can see that our test pattern is super pixelated, which means that any texture or content we put on there is going to be pixelated as well. So back in our Screens tab, let's fix this canvas resolution problem by determining how many pixels are going to be on our projection surface here. Now, the proper way to do this would be to set up a projector study and actually set it up in 3D space, figure out exactly how many pixels are going to land on this surface. But we can kind of fake it here. If we turn off our locks to our size here, I can just do a little math. I know that my projectors are 1,280 pixels, and I've got 2 of them. And I know that they've got about a 40% overlap. So I can actually say that that is about 0.6, which gets us to about 1536. And vertically, I've got about 800 pixels. Now, I happen to know, because I do this project a lot, that the actual per pixel count that's going to fall on these is about 1880. So we could get that by saying 1280 times 2 times something like 0.75. And I know that there's some pixels falling off on either side. So that's where I get that 1880 number. So we've moved into our mapping tab. Let's go grab our projectors, which I know are ML750s from Optima. So I'll grab those, and I can click that into the workspace, click and drag that. And we can see the projectors actually dropped a little further away, which is just fine. I can always look in my project tab to see what my projectors in the project are. This project tree is really, really useful if you are ever lost and you can't see an object. So I'll grab this, and let's use the auto transform editor. I'm going to say that I actually want 2 of these, and I want them to align with Hero Screen in a 2x1 setup. So I'll hit apply, and that's aligned my 2 projectors. I'll click on one of them. Let's name this PJ House Left, and we'll do PJ House Right here. Now we need to assign our outputs. We'll go to the Live tab, and I can turn on my output identification. We can see that my house left is output 5, and my house right is output 7. Go ahead and turn that off. So output 5, I can click and drag onto this projector. And for output 7, we could use I/O routing if we wanted. But in this case, I'm going to do one other thing. I'm actually going to click on the projector itself, and I can click on this output parameter, and I can just select it here. So now if I turn on my test patterns, we should see those test patterns on my feed down here. One thing I want to point out here, if I start moving this projector and I let go, we can see that my test pattern has changed a little bit on my output. We can do that on this projector as well, so we can see that a little better. What this is showing us is that by default, our projectors are almost treated like cameras, and they see our projection surface as if it were a camera. So this frustum is actually just a representation of what it can see. Now, what that means, and if I'm Control Z out of that a little bit, is that by default, I would have to, if I wanted to get the most perfect warp, I would have to put these in exactly the right place using my world transformation with exactly the right rotation to really get this warp to be super precise. That can be really important for something like a curved screen or a 3D object. And in fact, we have a feature that's a little more advanced called marker calibration, that's over here, that would allow us to actually place those projectors in real space. But for something as simple as a flat screen or 2 or 3 projector blend, we can just get them pretty close and we should be able to warp it into place. There's another feature called feed areas that would allow us to get even more particular about our warping and blending without having that camera effect. But that's something we will get into in another video. All right, let's do a little warping. I'll select one of my projectors here, and let's go to the Warp tab. And I can start warping this into place, and you can see that that is changing on my feed. But this other projector is getting in the way a little bit, so I'm going to go to my project tree. And that house left projector, if I right click, I can actually black that one out while I'm working on the house right one. So I'm going to select my warp point here, and I'm actually going to be able to warp it into place. And I'm using the arrow keys and Alt to actually get that into place. So that Alt is allowing me to shift around, and I'm looking around my camera. That's pretty close, I would say. So now I'm going to select the other projector, and let's unblack that one out, black this one out. Now I'm going to warp this one into place. And one thing to know about warping is that if you want, you can spend a lot of time on this. I'm going to do this fairly quickly and just kind of rough it in, but you could spend quite a bit of time and really dial this in if you wanted to. Let's see how that looks. That's not too bad. So obviously in the middle, we've got some kind of weirdness going on in our overlap, but if I go to my soft edge, I can add a soft edge warped here. And I'll just align that with the left side, maybe turn that gradient up a little bit. And then I'll pick my other projector, do the same thing with the right side. And that's starting to look pretty okay. If you're constantly looking at lines, you're going to find that you could spend forever on this kind of thing. And trust me, I've done it. Let's go to compositing and see what a little bit of content looks like. So I'll click and drag this Atlanta onto here. Let's turn off my test pattern and hit play. Yeah, that doesn't look so bad. Now, we could spend a lot more time working on this, but for right now, this actually looks pretty good. All right. Thanks for joining us.